I think we can safely say that everyone, even the younger folk among us, has heard of the sinking of the Titanic. If you haven't, then you must live under a rock, or you're stuck on the International Space Station. If you've looked at the thumbnail or the title of this video, then you'll know I'm going to tell you that the Titanic, despite what you've been told or learned, did not sink. Everything I'm about to reveal is based on actual evidence. Evidence from first-hand witnesses, survivors, and accounts from the British and American Disaster Inquiry, unlike the debunkers who are out there, once again, to cover up this fraud. Welcome to Dot 13, the Titanic Lie. It's April the 15th, and the year is 1912. It is recorded and well documented that on this day, the greatest ever ship, the Titanic, hit an iceberg, sank, and plunged nearly 2 miles to the bottom of the sea, killing 1,507 of its passengers and crew. Well, I'm going to tell you different. Actually, I'm going to prove something different. I'm going to prove that it wasn't the Titanic that sank that dark, cold, moonlit night, but her sister ship, the Olympic. I'm going to tell you the real story. White Star Line, a company owned partly by banking billionaire J.P. Morgan, had contracted the ship company Harland and Wolff to build 3 huge ocean liners, the biggest and most grand the world had ever seen: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The Olympic and the Titanic were sister ships and were almost, but not entirely, the exact same. A contradiction in terms, I know, but all will become clear and apparent. The story I'm about to tell you is actual events. Not like what you are told by Hollywood and the like, you know the crack, when they state things like, this film is based on actual events. So it's based on actual events, not is the actual events then. Lord Pirrie, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, along with the chairman of White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, wanted to create a fleet of unprecedented ocean liners that dominated the seas. They knew that the only liners that were crossing the North Atlantic at the time were immigrant ships, commonly known as coffin ships, due to their unsafe reputations. These coffin ships were known for being uninsurable, and the industry was known for its fraudulent behaviours. On the 14th of June, 1911, the first of the great ships, the Olympic, set sail on her maiden voyage. Just 1 week later, she was involved in an accident just outside New York and had to be brought back to dry dock for repairs. The Olympic limped back and underwent a week's repairs. White Star Line were not happy with this, as they needed to make money on her immediately because of the huge building costs. Just 3 months after this, the Olympic was involved in another accident, a more damaging accident. This time she had a collision with the warship HMS Hawke. HMS Hawke had been sucked into the Olympic's wake and collided with her at some speed. The collision damaged HMS Hawke's bow and made significant damage to the Olympic. This time a full investigation into the accident had to be conducted. It was so by the Admiralty. The Admiralty's conclusion was it was the Olympic was at fault, although evidence proves otherwise. Not only now was the Olympic virtually uninsurable, but the Olympic's injuries resulted in a massive hole in her stern, and more dangerously, it had bent the ship's keel, which caused a pronounced list to port. That part is to become important in this whole story. In October 1911, the Olympic limped back to port, failing several times en route, including throwing a propeller blade on a sunken wreck, which resulted in even more patched up repairs, before eventually making it back to dry dock in Belfast. It spent another 7 weeks in dry dock, set alongside the Titanic, receiving an extensive overhaul, including a large segment of steel plates to its port side. White Star Line's committee now knew it would never pass another trade inspection. They were livid. While the two ships, one the Titanic, which is yet to sail, and two the Olympic, who despite hardly ever being used was now deemed a sailing wreck, White Star Line concocted a plan. Pirrie and Ismay stared at the two ships. To the untrained, non-seafaring eye, the two ships looked identical. The only differences could be counted on one shaking hand. On the forward side of the sea deck, the Olympic had 16 portholes, while the Titanic had only 14. Whilst on B deck, the Olympic's passenger windows were evenly spaced, and not so on the Titanic. And the bridge of the Titanic extends a little further out than the Olympic's. This is when it is thought that the two ships were switched. See, every White Star liner had standard White Star issue, as in furniture, its tablewares, its linens, etc. The only internal difference was the flooring. The Olympic had carpet flooring, whilst the Titanic had been lino. Coincidentally, while the Olympic was in dry dock, White Star ordered for the Titanic to be carpeted. This only left the signage on the bow and the stern, the signage on the lifeboats, and the signage on the lifebelts. This would have been quite simple. There were very few reporters about, if any, and the camera was still very much in its infancy. Anyhow, White Star had frequently used pictures of the Titanic to advertise the Olympic while the Olympic was out to sea, so no one would have noticed. What about the workers, I hear you cry? Bear in mind that during this time there was a coal strike. Labour was hard to come by and infrequent. Workers often included whole families, and then if an employer wanted something done, off the record say, and it was refused, companies would sometimes dismiss the whole family for one person's refusal. And then times folk basically done as they were told. Workers were so scared to reveal truths. To swap the Olympic to the Titanic would have only taken a small crew a weekend to finish. Definitely plausible and definitely capable. Straight after this, both ships were ordered to conduct a sea trial. A normal sea trial would take just 2 days. It is recorded and documented that the Olympic sea trial was 2 days, but mysteriously, the Titanic, only 2 hours. Is this the first time they had sailed after swapping names? You be the judge. Let's take a few steps back. The captain of the Olympic, when it had the 2 accidents earlier, was one Captain Edward Smith. He was known to be a bit of a show-off and would push ships to their limits. Just after the sea trials, Smith was summoned. He was asked, despite virtually wrecking a brand new ship, the Olympic, if he would captain the Titanic on her maiden voyage. This is where the story becomes a little sketchy. Was he asked to captain the Titanic, or did he felt privileged to do so? Or was he ordered to captain the Titanic, knowing the plan, and felt obligated to do so because of what he had previously done to the last ship? Who knows? Once again, you be the judge. Either way, he had agreed as long as he could pick his own crew. Don't forget, at this time work was scarce. Yet despite this, they struggled to find firemen and greasers for the Titanic's maiden voyage. Did they know something? Were rumours abound? Add to this that White Star themselves were trying to stop people signing up for its voyage. Normally they would go the extra mile to advertise, but not this time. One officer, Officer Wilde, wrote a note to his sister which included the line, "I no longer like this ship." Was this because he knew he was still on the Olympic, of which he served previously? He died 3 days after writing this note. J.P. Morgan, yes, him of the banking family, was due to be a passenger on board the Titanic, but cancelled at the 11th hour along with 50 of his friends. Did they know the planned fate of the voyage? J.P. Morgan also had 3 valuable bronze statues aboard, destined for America. He had them removed just 1 hour before departure. I think he knew. Remember I mentioned earlier that there was a coal strike, making coal hard to come by, and when it was, the price during this time was extortionate. Well, a ship called the California was set sail for no apparent reason. It had no passengers aboard, it had no country destination, but what it did have was a cargo of thousands of sweaters. Strange. So the Titanic departed from Southampton docks on the 10th of April 1912 on the first leg of a journey to New York. Straight away, Captain Smith narrowly avoided 2 collisions, one with the SS City of New York and also with White Star Line's ocean liner, Oceanic. Despite this, the captain ordered the vessel to be put to full astern. The collision was avoided by a mere 4 feet. The Titanic headed towards northwest France at Cherbourg. Next port of call was Queenstown in Ireland to take on more passengers and stores. She reached Ireland around midday on the 11th of April. This is where conflicting figures appear. Some reports state that there was 2,240 passengers and crew on board, yet others, including the likes of Wikipedia, state less. So we'll say the Titanic was carrying around 2,200 bodies. I have to say as well that 10 days prior to the Titanic's maiden voyage, a fire had begun in one of the coal bins, but that didn't delay the launch. Strange again. This was still alight as it left Ireland and headed for the North Atlantic. On the 14th of April, the Titanic's radio operators received 6 messages, 3 iceberg warnings and 3 from the California. Remember, this was the ship that set off with no set destination. Were these messages from the California to notify the Titanic of its sea coordinates? Was it waiting for the Titanic so it could rescue the passengers in the pre-planned accident? Well, it's all becoming weird, that's for sure. Because of the iceberg warnings, Captain Smith ordered a new course to be set and headed further south. Meanwhile, the California sat and waited. Captain Lord, the captain of the California, slept fully clothed. I wonder why. He definitely knew something. A German ship, travelling a few miles south of the Titanic, sent numerous messages about a warning that they had passed 2 large icebergs. Captain Smith of the Titanic was never notified of these, allegedly. In the investigation, it was put down to the operators running repairs to the radio equipment. How convenient. We are only hours from the sinking now, so let us try and work this out. White Star Line have put a captain that has a dubious record in charge of the Titanic's maiden voyage. They tried to discourage passengers from buying tickets. Men refused to take work on the Titanic despite the lack of work available. Her sister ship is uninsurable. When it left Southampton, several passengers reported that it had a slight list to port. Just like the Olympic. It now has 16 portholes on C deck instead of 14. Its windows at B deck are no longer evenly spaced. It now had carpeted floors instead of lino. It only had a 2-hour sea trial before its so-called maiden voyage, and J.P. Morgan and 50 of his friends had cancelled their tickets. Oh, and now Captain Smith had not received the ice warnings. Both Captain Lord of the California and Captain Smith of the Titanic both slept fully clothed. It just seems so bizarre that all these coincidences could happen in a matter of a few days, don't you think? But there is one more massive coincidence to come, and it's the biggest of the lot, that proves without doubt that it wasn't the Titanic that sunk. It's now late into the evening on the 14th of April, and Captain Smith, despite entering Iceberg Alley, orders the ship's speed to be at 22 knots. That's only 2 knots below the Titanic's maximum speed. Command of the bridge had now passed to First Officer William Murdoch from Second Officer Charles Lightoller, while the captain, Captain Edward Smith, was asleep, fully clothed, just meters from the bridge. The lookouts had no binoculars. This was a mix-up at Southampton, apparently. Oops. At 20 to midnight, the lookout spotted an iceberg ahead, and it was large. He radioed the bridge, and First Officer Murdoch ordered the ship to maneuver port around. He had also ordered the ship's engines to reverse. This, in the resulting investigation, was a fatal move, as it would take too long for the ship to do these actions, and it would affect the use of the rudder. Murdoch should have known this. He probably did know that. If the ship had continued ahead, it more than likely would have missed the iceberg completely. Yet another mistake. The Titanic missed the iceberg head on, but scraped along its side, causing the lower part of the huge iceberg to rip a 12-foot square hole in its hull. There ended up around 300 feet of damage, including a long line of iron rivets that had popped during the iceberg's scrape. Iron rivets were used in repairs, just like the repairs on the Olympic. The ship began to flood immediately. It was taking in water at a rate of 15 times more than it could pump out. The ship was doomed, and most of the head crew knew it. After 35 minutes, the first distress call was made. After another 35 minutes, the first flare was sent into the night sky. The California, who was waiting for the distress flares, didn't realize the Titanic was 12 miles out of its navigation settings, and neither did the Titanic. The colors of the distress flares of the Titanic were red, white, and blue. Between the California and the Titanic was an illegal seal catching ship called the Samson. It had sent up white flares to notify the other seal ships of its finish and to head back to land. This obviously confused Captain Lord on the California, who repeatedly asked his crew, "What colour are the flares you see?" White was always the answer back. So Lord did not respond as he should have to save the passengers on the Titanic. By this time, I think Captain Smith on the Titanic was confused also, as he had expected the California to come and rescue all on board. After an hour and 25 minutes, he ordered the first lifeboat to be launched. A number of lifeboats were only half full. Did Smith still expect the California to come? It didn't. After what can only be described as mayhem and chaos, eventually RMS Carpathia came and rescued around 710 people. The ones still on board or in the freezing waters died that early morning, and I don't think they should have. I think it was a cover-up of huge costings, not only money, but more importantly of human lives, just so a shipping company could save money. It is said amongst bankers and shipping companies that if the Olympic would have been written off, then White Star Line would have gone bust. This would have meant JP Morgan would no longer have put any more money into the industry, and possibly over 20,000 jobs alone at Harland and Wolff would have been lost. Not to mention the employees at White Star Line, the casual labour created at the ports, and the other businesses that relied on the shipping industry. At the two investigations, British and American, it was asked how it had hit an iceberg. They stated that a ship of that size could spot an iceberg 5 or 6 miles away at least, and the turning circle of the ship was 3/4 of a mile. It was also disclosed that the Titanic's insurance was increased to £12.5 million 4 days before its maiden voyage. The Olympic, because of its list to port and its bent keel, was only worth £1 million. The insurance paid out £12.5 million just 5 days after the sinking. I think they were as bewildered as I am. Oh yeah, that one massive piece of evidence that proves everything without a doubt. When these 3 huge ships were built, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, it was ordered that each will have its name engraved on its side. I'm not talking a little engraved, I'm talking several feet, 4 feet. In 1988, a spy dive was conducted down to where the Titanic lays on the bottom of the sea. It revealed one piece of evidence that towers above all the other evidence. Plates around 4 feet had been riveted on the side of the ship with the letters Titanic, Titanic. During its 70-year-old rest down in the depths, a couple of the letters had fallen off. This had revealed 2 large engraved letters, M and P. Now, I ain't no bearded English scholar, but there ain't no M and P in the word Titanic. But there is in the Olympic. Well, that's the end of dot 13. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and please subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. I would also appreciate if you could share my videos to friends and family, because I've got a feeling YouTube have shadow banned me. Anyway, I'll see you in dot 14. Take care.